Joseph Stalin's direct involvement in certain events during the Cold War significantly furthered it and changed the future of countries. His approval and support of the North in the Korean War initiated the beginning for proxy wars in the Cold War and caused a split between the North and South Korea. He also assisted Mao Zedong in establishing a communist regime in China, changing its ideology and history forever. The rapid increase of nuclear weapons was also approved by Stalin, which led to the concept of MAD, mutually assured destruction, and encouraged the use of more proxy wars. Stalin was paranoid, which significantly corroded his diplomatic relationship with the Allied powers after World War II. His paranoia made it very hard for nations to combat his hostile behaviour. These actions show that Stalin played an important role in the continuation of the Cold War and was responsible for drastically changing Korea and China's history. Joseph Stalin had significant involvement in the Korean War, which overall contributed to the tension during the Cold War. The Korean War, which was perpetrated by the North who invaded the South, was one of the most significant events of the Cold War. There were multiple factors that led to Stalin's final decision to approve the invasion of the South. Since the North was heavily dependent on the USSR economically, Stalin ultimately had the decision-making powers of the invasion over Kim Il-sung, and therefore was inherently responsible. According to historical scholar J.R. Campbell, author of The Wrong War, it was Stalin who approved of the decision to attack the South. He argues that Stalin believed the war yielded geopolitical and strategic benefits for the USSR, which outweighed the risks of sending the North to war. Geopolitically and strategically, controlling the North strengthened the USSR's position in Northeast Asia. Most importantly though, controlling North Korea disrupted the US control of Japan, preventing a tight-knit Japan-US alliance which would threaten the USSR. Another one of the key factors in Stalin's decision was his belief that the US would not become involved if the North invaded, and that there were significant valuable assets in the South even if the US didn't intervene. Nonetheless, the US became involved, and the Korean War became one of the most notorious proxy wars of the 20th century. This also set the precedent for further proxy conflicts during the Cold War. For example, the Truman Doctrine was implemented and became a significant part of US foreign policy to counter USSR domination around the globe. It involved setting up US-friendly governments in strategic areas and points of interest. However, to properly analyze Stalin's involvement in the Korean War, the question must be asked: would it have happened if he didn't order the invasion? Ultimately, the answer is no. North Korea just didn't have the manpower or resources to fight the US-supported South Korea, and significantly relied upon the economic and material support of the USSR. Therefore, Kim Il-sung had to have the decision approved by Stalin himself in order to gain the resources from the USSR. If Stalin did not approve, the North would have not been able to host a successful invasion. Joseph Stalin had a substantial impact on the victorious result of the Mao-led Chinese side in the Chinese Civil War of 1950, changing China's entire political ideology. The Chinese victory can be acclaimed by Stalin's tactic to determine the best-fitting communist leader for the Chinese Revolution according to Leninist principles. Stalin appointed and supported a leader who could appeal to the struggling peasants and workers in China who he believed were suffering from imperialist officials. Mao perceived to change the way peasants in society were viewed. According to Morris Watnick, peasants under the imperial rule were isolated and unable to change their status in society. Mao proposed that he would change their entire lives, from the peasant economies to the essential receptiveness of their livelihoods as peasants. He proposed a complete revolution of the Chinese people. According to Peter Tang, author of Stalin's role in the communist victory in China, the most significant points of the communist victory in China can be attributed to Stalin's contribution and the development of the United Front tactic. Stalin advised the Communist Party of the importance of being able to gain the trust and form an alliance with the Chinese proletariat. Stalin also instructed that in order to achieve this, the Communist Party must have its own party platform, organization, and course of action without any form of opposition. Stalin undoubtedly believed that without the power of the proletarian class, a Chinese communist victory was out of the question. Stalin was particularly interested in China due to its enormous size and large population, and similar to North Korea, it shielded the USSR from capitalist-led forces from the south, partially satisfying his uncontrollable paranoia. Stalin also saw ahead and realized that helping Mao to establish a communist-led China would significantly threaten the United States. Therefore, the Chinese Revolution, a significant part of the Cold War, was successful due to Stalin's efforts in it. Joseph Stalin had a significant impact on the development of nuclear weapons for the USSR, furthering the Cold War substantially. It featured multiple proxy wars and was waged on a political, ideological, and economical level. Preventing both sides from entering direct conflict was that each side possessed multiple nuclear weapons capable of destroying each other. Soon after this, the concept of MAD, mutually assured destruction, arose and became one of the main reasons for both sides to avoid direct conflict. Direct conflict from both the USSR and the US would result in MAD. Therefore, this prompted both sides to increase their involvement in proxy wars around the globe, as it would mean they are not fighting directly. After knowing each side had enough nuclear weapons to destroy each other, a nuclear arms race began. The USSR began manufacturing nuclear weapons as fast as possible to destroy the US's atomic monopoly. Stalin had a direct impact on this as he approved of the production of 8 atomic weapons each month. This was ordered as he realized that the United States had planned the mining of plutonium and uranium-235 for their nuclear weapon development. After learning of this, the USSR nuclear production program projected itself to be one of Stalin's highest priorities. To fully question Stalin furthering the development of nuclear weapons, which is one of the main driving factors of the Cold War, would it have happened if he hadn't developed nuclear weapons? Stalin's paranoia significantly accelerated the USSR nuclear development program and potentially increased tension between other nuclear-armed countries. According to the authors of classic issues in Soviet foreign policy, Stalin's paranoia was one of the primary operational factors for the origin of the Cold War. From this, we can assume that one of the main driving factors of the Cold War, being nuclear weapons, increased drastically under Stalin's reign due to his paranoia. If he didn't continue developing, a potential de-armament treaty could have been reached. This brings me on to my next point, Stalin's paranoia. Stalin's paranoia furthered the Cold War significantly as his actions became unpredictable, making the suspension of indirect hostilities much harder. Stalin was paranoid that the United States would use the power of nuclear weapons to intimidate him, but he was determined not to let that happen. In order to combat this, he adopted a foreign policy which he called tenacity and steadfastness. This policy involved Stalin acting in a stubborn manner from fear that the other Allied powers would think he is weak and easily manipulative. An example of this was his decision to stop the Western powers from entering Berlin, or the Berlin Blockade as it was sometimes called. Joseph Stalin had already planned to hinder the West's ability to properly operate in Berlin after the war. Wilhelm Pieck, leader of the Soviet-backed German political party SED, met with Stalin to discuss the scheduled elections for Berlin and the impact the Western forces would have on them. Pieck argued that the Soviet forces could be spared from embarrassment if the Western forces are removed. Stalin decided to formulate a plan to force the Western powers out of Berlin. This decision by Stalin created the divide in Europe and the subsequent creation of the Iron Curtain over Europe. Even if the United States had not proceeded with further development of nuclear weapons, Stalin would have anyways. Due to his paranoia, he would have thought that if the United States didn't continue developing, it was a deceitful maneuver against him. According to the works of Vladimir Bekhterev, a renowned Russian psychologist, classified Stalin as a paranoiac. A paranoiac is someone who suffers from severe paranoia. As a result of this diagnosis, Stalin ordered the death of Vladimir as he was deemed a threat to Stalin's regime. This is a prime example of Stalin's paranoia and the fearful and unpredictable environment it created. If Stalin was not as paranoid, the Cold War could have potentially been avoided. According to Evan Maudsley, author of The Stalin Years, Stalin viewed his neighbours and previous allies as threats. This is carried on from his paranoid views during World War II. He did not even trust members of his own party, despite them sharing similar ideological views. This paranoia could have stemmed from the 1930s, when the USSR was an isolated socialist nation surrounded by other nations who were fundamentally opposite in their ideology. This paranoia prevented any form of trust building between nations, especially his previous allies, Britain and the United States. Any form of peace, Stalin viewed as a possible tactic against him and combated against it. If Stalin was not paranoid, an overly assertive foreign policy could have been avoided. Based on this information, we can conclude that Stalin played a vital role in the continual development of the Cold War. His approval and subsequent economic support to the North in the Korean War created tension that is still there today. It created a reoccurrence of proxy wars during the Cold War from both sides. He supported Mao Zedong in the Chinese Revolution, which saw the establishment of one of the largest communist nations to this day. He supported the revolution in hope that they would become a threat to the US, proving that Stalin did not have any intention of reaching a peaceful agreement. His unpredictable actions also prevented any progress of peace, especially since he had adopted a policy of stubbornness to counter any move made by the US. From here, he accelerated the development of nuclear arms to counter the US arsenal, creating a nuclear arms race. Therefore, Joseph Stalin had a significant role in furthering the progress of the Cold War, which changed the world as we know it.